so yeah, the title of my talk is Hindsight Accountability, Deterring Regulation Gaming, and I will define the terms shortly. The theme of the conference was regulation, and so I was thinking about all the ways to regulate new technology, such as cybersecurity, hospitals hit by ransomware attacks. Sometimes they can't access medical records and patients even die sometimes. And then, of course, artificial intelligence. I'll have a bit less to say about that, but that's also one of the topics. And one of the suggestions, this is unfortunate, this somewhere else, is the thing we need to do for this new technologies is apply things like building codes. There's a paper that said we need a building code for building code. And I realized after I wrote that is some maybe non-native English speakers, they might not understand. This is like a play on words. The first phrase building code means the rules we have for houses, the code for buildings. And the other building code is writing software. So this is the type of call. And because building codes made buildings safe, they have fewer fires, they don't collapse as much. So the logic goes, rules for software would make software safe. The word safety even appeared in the AI principles. My claim is that's not going to work, unfortunately. Static regulations will fail, even if, regardless of whether it's simple or complicated. That whole metric doesn't matter. The problem is that we're in dynamic domains. And we actually have some intuition about this because we don't try to apply building codes to catching burglars. We don't say you must have bars on your windows because then they just find another way to get in. Burglars are dynamic, and likewise software. The whole reason it's soft and not hard is because it's dynamic. It's always changing, and so is the environment that it's used in. So specifically, though, there's a specific kind of dynamic domain I'll focus on here, which is due to gaming or regulation. I define that as complying with the regulation's metrics in a way that subverts the regulation's objective. And a simple example comes from Mr. Ulrich Hofrage, who couldn't be here today, which is why I'm recording this. When an athlete pretends not to be doping and even passes the drug test, but they were actually doping. This is an example of gaming the regulation. In many cases, they knew what the test was going to be, and they specifically did things not to be flagged in the test. So to talk about how to regulate domains with gaming, I'm going to talk why we need something special for gaming. And to do that, first, I'll talk about the regulatory tools for dynamic domains, the things I mentioned in the beginning, like cybersecurity and so on, and how those would not deter gaming, even though they'd be helpful for other dynamic conditions. And then I'll talk about this idea of hindsight accountability that can address gaming. I don't mean it's the only tool. It's one to start. There's other tools, but I think it's a good start. And there's a bonus, because my audience today is a bunch of academics. I'll talk about how these ideas might also apply to improving incentives in science, where there's gaming of all the publication metrics or other metrics applied to researchers. So first topic, dynamic domains, how we regulate them and why gaming is special. I'll talk briefly about why we have regulations, how change and dynamism causes regulations to fail and some of the standard fixes, and then why gaming is a little different. So backing up to the housing codes, why do we start housing codes? The regulator has an objective, such as fewer fires in buildings. There was the Great Chicago Fire that went badly, burned most of the city down. So, but it's hard to just tell people don't have fires. So you look for a proxy metric. So for example, smoke detectors were observed to correlate with fewer fires. Buildings with smoke detectors had fewer fires. They were extinguished quickly, fewer deaths, less money lost. So then they made a rule, have one smoke detector on each floor, and then you can hire inspectors, they can check for it. And indeed, this has been a successful regulation. And the way to define success is you had your objective of fewer fires, you check, and indeed, fires were reduced. I cited a 2024 study, but there are many before that showing that these do work. Okay, the problem is change can cause failure. In particular, the proxy metric you chose and the objective can change their relationship. And one example in the realm of fire safety is that climate change has resulted in more wildfires, and smoke detectors don't help with that. Out in California, all those houses had smoke detectors and they still all burned down. I'm also going to talk, though, that there's actually different sources of change, and these will matter. exogenous change is unrelated to the regulation. So for example, the climate change didn't happen because of smoke detectors. I know we use plastic for it, but yeah, and for the most it's separate. Endogenous change, though, and these are words from economists, are spurred by the regulation itself. And the reason these distinctions matter, it's not just what happened. Okay. Oh, I just went on a slideshow mode. I must have bumped the button. The reason these distinctions matter is that there are different regulatory approaches for them. So for exogenous change, I'll talk about adaptive regulation and regulatory sandboxes. Ricardo already mentioned the sandboxes. And for endogenous change, I argue that basically all of economics is about endogenous change. And then there's also some critiques that talk more about alignment being necessary for that to work. So let's start with the exogenous change side. One of the main simplest ways to deal with exogenous change is just to update your regulations. So instead of having one decision once to say smoke detectors are what we'll use, and that's the final answer, you keep monitoring the situation. Is the rate of fire still going down? Is it starting to go up? If it's starting to go up, you review your tools, you find new metrics, and then you declare a new updated regulation. And for domains that move more quickly, you simply have more updates. Sandboxes, regulatory sandboxes. The main goal of these is learning, collaborative learning. They have a constrained space, limited time, there's data collected, and together the regulator and the innovator figure it out. So for self-driving cars, for example, I was just in Phoenix a few weeks ago. You go there and the airport, there's big ads that you can take cars that are Waze, and I forgot, not Waze, I'm sorry, that's something, but Waymo and other companies, and you can go around. Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to do it. I saw them around, but so you can do it in that area, and they're helping collect data, and any incidents need to be reported, et cetera. And the goal, though, long-term goal is to have regulations that apply everywhere so that someday in Rome, you can take your self-driving car to the conference. And as I mentioned, this is related to Ricardo Vallada's feedback loops. Yes, just added that slide during the talk. Interestingly, the EU AI Act wants to benefit from this too. They have mandated that each member state must have at least one regulatory sandbox for AI. And I tried to throw up an example, and it turns out everyone's still trying to figure out what does a regulatory sandbox mean for an AI, because you can't constrain it by geography. So they're still trying to find like, okay, it's by use case, and there didn't seem to be a good example yet. And then there's some deadline. This is the typical EU way to make regulations. Here's your goal, figure it out by, May 2026 or whatever it is. So we'll see what comes out of it. The other side of the sources of change are the endogenous change. And here's where economics and alignment play a big role. An example of endogenous change, this is the one I had in the UK, but I actually just got a great one from Halvarian. So the UK one was they raised taxes on petrol, people switched to diesel, and oops, diesel actually also has a lot of bad emissions, just different ones. The example from Hal was, it's in Bogota, right? They were trying to, you're right, Arkies. Yeah, sorry. We were talking about Halvarian earlier. Anyway, so Bogota, you're like, who's she talking about? In Bogota, they want to reduce congestion. So based on your number, the last number of your license plate, you can only drive on certain days. And what happened surprised me. People bought two cars. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So they gamed the regulation. They've obeyed it ostensibly, but they didn't fulfill the objective. And like I mentioned, most of economics is about that. Certainly the Lucas critique was also connecting it to the micro level. You have the macro goal, micro level, model people's preferences and expectations. You have to get all the options. You have to think of the fact they might buy another car or they might switch to diesel. You manage those, they call it substitution effects, all this kind of stuff. This is basically all of economics is dealing with endogenous change. But even economists have seen there's limits to these methods. There's this wonderful book by Samuel Bowles, The Moral Economy, Why Good Incentives Are No Substitute for Good Citizens. The basic problem is that people who disagree with the regulator's objective, so if you think this environmental claims about climate emissions are bullshit, you're just going to go out and buy a second car, or you're going to not take the bus, or you're going to buy the diesel, whatever. So he's pointed this out and has emphasized you really need to build alignment and public trust. We've talked about trust in other situations too. And yeah, then they'll actually take the bus or whatever. They need to believe in it, and then the incentives, even then, maybe they won't, but at least you have a better chance. So this is the framework I've set up. I certainly haven't covered everything, just high level. But the important point here is that gaming is on the endogenous change side, but it won't fit with either the economics or the alignment. And here's a reminder of what gaming the regulation is: complying with the regulation's metric in a way that subverts the objective. So it already assumes implicitly that you're not aligned with the objective. If you're subverting the objective, clearly you don't have that alignment that Samuel Bowles said was important. And then related to that too, this is an example of sports doping, and actually talking about ChatGPT usage. First of all the images are by ChatGPT. And secondly, this example of sports doping was actually one that ChatGPT gave me when I said, here's how I define gaming the regulation. Here's some examples I know, give me more. And what I loved about this example was, even though you knew it was possible to buy a second car, in the case of sports doping, there's new drugs being invented. You can't know what new performance enhancing drug is going to be invented. It's just truly impossible to stop it ahead of time. So that's why I like this example. So here's more specifically specific use case. So there's a ban on steroid doping in sports, but I don't know exactly when, but at some point EPOs were invented. I don't remember what it stands for. It's a kind of steroid that would pass the test, though. They knew that the Olympic Committee couldn't pick up on it. And some athletes used it, including, we now know, Rashid Ramzi. So he passed the steroid test for the 2008 Olympics in Beijing. He won a gold medal. And then finally in 2009, since they knew people were using it, they invented the test for steroids, for EPO specifically. So it's frustrating, right? Going through the situation. And then once you add that to its test result, they just come up with some other drug. There's another problem in the alignment sense, which is most athletes at least say they wouldn't want to deal with performance enhancing drugs. They say they don't want it, but there's this pressure because if someone else has used it, they win, they get the sponsorship, they can afford a career in sports, they can afford to train 12 hours a day. Meanwhile, you're working your job at UPS or whatever all day just to earn the money. Like, you can't keep up with that. It's not fair. So what ends up happening over time, they drop out, and the people who stay in sports are the dopers. And over time, what little, might have had a lot of people who support this goal. It's unlike the environmental one. These are people who support the goal, but they're being outcompeted by the other people. So like, okay, Gene, now what's the solution? You spent 10 minutes approximately telling us about the problem. Talk a bit about solutions. Again, it's not a silver bullet, but it's a start. And interestingly, the other nice thing about the sports doping example is they have found not a perfect solution, but they've made progress. So here again was the sports doping thing. And the idea they had was to retain the sample, the original sample. So normally in a medical record, you just retain the results of here's the results of your blood test. So they keep the actual vial, or maybe they have a second vial. They stick it in a freezer. And then when they invent the test, they pull it out and they check for the EPO. And then they strip the metals. And Rashid Ramzi had his medal stripped. I don't know if this is an actual picture of what he looked like when they came and took it away, but they took it away. And so the goal of this idea, I came up with this term hindsight accountability for it. Maybe it's not the best. I also used structured deferred judgment and decided that was too long. So maybe this. And the basic idea is to have retroactive consequences when new information is available. So 3 pieces overall: the archiving of evidence, systematic tracking of the events and the people involved, then reviewing when you have more information, when you have the EPO test. There are other things that can trigger the review. I'll talk about that. And then the third is retroactive action. So you reclassify, you reanalyze, use your human judgment. It's not just automated. This part cannot be automated. You need human judgment of what you need to look for. You need to know to look for EPO, and then have retroactive consequences based on that. So one point is the first 2 could still fulfill the ideas of adaptive regulation, where you just update it. So the truly novel thing is to add the retroactive action. And to do that, you really need to archive the evidence. The adaptive regulation wouldn't necessarily need to keep it around. And the thing is, there's 2 effects. So the first one is kind of straightforward. It's just to deliver appropriate consequences. So, even if you had like a snail or whatever, and you killed off the snails using EPO. Like they don't need any foresight to understand this. Over time, you'd have fewer snails using EPO. But humans, of course, can also understand if you announce this is your new policy, that you are going to strip metals if we are caught, it will deter gaming. And the theme is if you game the system now, accountability will catch up later. And here's the athlete thinking it over, the potential doper, considering long-term, not just short-term. It shifts the time frame to that 10 years that they're going to hold your sample. You don't have to worry for 10 years they're going to catch you. And it's supposed to deter them. They imagine what's going to happen, what it's going to feel like 5 years from now or 1 year from now, they suddenly strip your medal. And it gives honest athletes reassurance that maybe they do have a fair chance. So let me get into more specifics. So I mentioned sports already has an example of what I call this hindsight accountability. I'll also talk about examples in banking and even in cybersecurity. And then the fun part, seeing what we can do with academics. So banking, long-term problem, bankers and others, but bankers also game their bonuses. You make a good deal, you sell your mortgage-backed security, you get your bonus, and then you move on, and then the financial system collapses, and you get to keep your money. And in a sense, it essentially incentivizes people to just make the deal and don't care about the long-term consequences. And recall our goal is to get people more interested in the long-term consequences. Taleb has talked about skin in the game. So what do you do to get people skin in the game? They call it clawbacks. The deals are tracked over time. And if the deal goes bad, the bonus must be returned. So you need the tracking. I mean, if the person has left the country, you're in trouble. I guess they can't force you to stay, but some way to track and get the money back. And this is now part of the Basel III regulations where they recommend, they don't require, but they recommend that banks use these. And the regulator, of course, cares because they have to bail out the bank when it goes down. Other businesses can do what they want, but for banks, they try to encourage these clawbacks. And the effect, again, twofold. One, the bank gets at least some of their money back. It depends how much they lost, but at least the bonus amount comes back. But the more important one is the banker themselves is deterred from making the risky deal in the first place. That's what we really care about. That's where the bigger effect is going to be. So another example from banking is that criminals sometimes misuse and trick banks. So police have used the technique of follow the money to find crimes. And criminals realized this, and so they started laundering the money with legitimate transactions. You make enough legitimate transactions and you can hide it. And apparently this term originally came from someone from my own hometown, not the Pope, Al Capone. I'm from Chicago, if you didn't know. And he would literally, so he was a bootlegger, alcohol bootlegger. It was illegal at the time. So he gets the money, the cash from the alcohol, and he bought a bunch of laundromats, and the laundromats is a high cash business. And so all this revenue is actually from the laundromat. So that's how the term launder the money comes, but usually talking more about the bank transactions.
You should, but in Calabria, they even know this.
I'm not sure. Anyway, so the regulation that came about was, it's called Know Your Customer, or KYC. It's not just in the US, this is also in a lot of international countries. Banks must verify your identity. So whenever you make any kind of financial transaction, like when I want to contribute $1 toward the Guardian newspaper, it requires a whole bunch of information for me to do that because of this whole Know Your Customer thing. And the goal is to track patterns to be able to flag anomalies. So if I say I'm someone running a small cafe and suddenly I'm wiring $500,000 to a foreign country, this is not just a fraud alert potentially. It can trigger the suspicious activity report that goes actually through government agencies. So that's examples of tracking that give long-term consequences in banking. I'm going to go through cybersecurity a bit now too. This is also, there have been calls, there are some government regulations coming about. I won't go through those here. Here I'll talk more about what private industry has done because I think there's some nice stories here. So there's a problem in the 2000s with antivirus software. It had been successful, the first viruses came out soon after the first emails, not soon after, but whatever, reasonably soon. So they would get a digital fingerprint called a hash on the file. You could keep the whole file, but those are really big. That would be just too much database stuff, especially in those days. So they just get a hash, which is kind of like a mini version of it, summarizing the key part of the file. But what ended up happening is virus makers made hundreds of minor modifications to bypass the filter. And at one point, by 2009, Symantec, that's one of the antivirus companies, had received 240 million threat hashes per year. It's a lot to keep up with. It was just like a cat and mouse game. It's almost like the doping thing, but just happening at very, very high speed. So this made an interesting shift. So some of the stuff I've talked about has been tracking things, the samples, events, and transactions, but you can also track people. Who causes those things to happen and who are the gamers? And the insight was that there are fewer bad people than bad files. So what they did, for example, is here's a user and it's a new user. So they send an email, we trust it. But eventually, over time, enough people complain or we notice things that we classify it as spam. That's the red box. But now that they have one email classified as a virus, we increase the probability that this person is a deliberate virus sender. I mean, it's possible someone sent you something and you forwarded it and you didn't realize it had something. So we don't want to immediately make it 100%. So 10%. But your next email over time, we eventually find that one also turns out to have a virus in it. So now we say, oh, this person has a 50% chance of being a deliberate virus sender. And then, you get enough of those and you say that person's 100%. As soon as they send that email, this is the one marked W, we're just going to put it in everyone's spam box and sequester it. So the idea is you track the people, this one person, you have one classification, but you had, this is, here's an example of 4 emails, but it's potentially hundreds of emails that you could have done. And each one is slightly different. So you can't do it by the email. One was X, one was Y, one was Z, one was W. There's slightly different content in each one, but they all come from the same person. So if you can identify the person and classify the person, you simplified your problem. All right, so here's the fun one. This one, there's a little bit of examples. The others were clear examples of hindsight tracking. This is more speculative about stuff we could do, stuff we do, and stuff we could do. So what's the problem I'm trying to solve? What's my objective? The problem is high quantity, low quality. Due to publication pressure, academics make a large number of low quality publications. Now there's different problems like the salami slicing one, but here I'm focusing on the reproducibility problem. In medicine, Ioannidis has said most published research findings are false, that sort of thing. So the idea of what to track I thought about was retractions. That yes, we do track them in Retraction Watch, but it's just hard to find them. And I think it would help to have them more clearly marked in all stages of research and all downstream uses. So here's a publisher. This is good. I think this was PNAS. I should have written down the name of it. Yeah, Psychological and Cognitive Sciences, there it says. And there is the metadata here. First of all, the metadata on the bottom left saying this article has been retracted in bright red. That's good. The other one that's kind of funny is putting the word retracted into the title, which is probably, again, it's almost like a hacky way to get it in there. The metadata is good, but it's just not good tracking of this. Because then when you search on Google Scholar, the only indication that one is retracted is that title word, which is lucky they put it there. But it just seems too minor to me. It seems too easy to miss it. And then I was also at first confused why the article seemed to be twice, and digging in, this does not indicate that the one on top is like a rewrite on the one on the bottom. You have to click down and figure it out. Just having this kind of structure better. Now, I work at Google. I don't work in the Scholar part, but that's clearly something they just do to be nice. So the chances they'll fix it.
Equivalent with the retracted article.
Sorry about it?
Is it to put the retract at the beginning is coherent with the content of the article.
Yeah.
Signing at the beginning versus.
Oh yeah, that is funny. Yeah, it's ironic that of course I chose the honesty studies on purpose, of course, and other stuff. But on top of that, it's signed at the beginning, and there it's signed at the beginning. So then the other thing is once you've found the article, then you put it into your article manager. I use Zotero, and that even has kind of very, very weak tracking retractions. I've seen it do retractions before. It says it's built in Retraction Watch. But there's this particular article doesn't turn up as retracted for some reason, Zotero. This one by Dan Ariely, the second one there. And so I'm like, oh, I'll just mark it as retracted myself. So I know. And it doesn't have a metadata field for it. I can't even so I might forget later and accidentally cite it or something. I mean, I won't, not the Dan Ariely one, but for some lesser known person, I might accidentally cite it. So clearly marking it, it would be great if as you read an article online, you could see, oh, this one was retracted or whatever, or if an article had too many citations that were retracted. And then I was thinking maybe even retracted or questioned and resolved if it's all resolved. I could overcomplexify this a bit. Then I thought maybe we do the same shift of tracking the people more than the articles, which I know people would hate, but that's where the consequences really hit. So if you've had any paper retracted, any related paper would get this kind of questioned or under review. And then the one that I also thought was interesting, this is related to gaming, I was just hearing about it at the coffee hour, co-authors of a paper who were on that have their articles also marked as questioned. And the point of that is then it gives you incentive not to just throw your name on a paper. I was hearing about a conference, I remember it was Oliver talking about it, right? A conference where at the conference, the first thing is you get to just fill in the name of your institution. They add you to the big paper and then you go skiing. You won't want to do that if potentially, if there's 100 people and one of them ends up having had a retraction, now that whole paper gets questioned because they're part of these people who do it. So anyway, I'm just trying to think how to get these consequences flowing better. And then the other one that pushes to the general public. So it's frustrating for me. I talk with a lot of non-academics and they keep citing stuff. And I'm like, oh no, like power poses by Amy Cuddy. I know that's been retracted. And so this one, at least if you go to TED, there's a small note in small font, which if you read basically says, some of these things may have been questioned, It's a little hard to read. I'd prefer something more visible, more obvious, but at least it's there, but not for Dan Ariely. I couldn't find anything on TED that has any kind of warning for any of it, and that's just terrible. I don't know how do you get TED to go along with it? Like maybe it looks bad for them. They have no incentive. Like how do we give them the incentive to actually track it? I don't know. I don't know how to fix it, but I know it's a problem. Okay, so now you can let your blood relax. No more criticizing academia. The goal again is just better consequences, clarity for all users, and deterrence. All the good researchers in this room will be fine. You shouldn't have to change anything you do. We're just trying to get people to think more about the long-term quality. And I also I won't give this adequate coverage, but I am aware that the system can be abused and has problems. So I'll talk briefly about the guardrails. There'll surely be more time on it. It's expensive to do the tracking. We're just talking about adding all that retraction. Who's going to pay for doing all that? There are risks to privacy. Certainly for the athletes, they've complained a lot of how invasive this testing can be. They can show up at their home at any time and try to test them. And then unfairness, which is the one, when I first mentioned this idea to Ulrich, he was right away all up in arms about. So expense, yeah, elite sports, other places, you have to think, does the cost outweigh the benefits and who's going to pay for it? You don't have every 6-year-old going to their soccer/football match having to get pee in a cup. Not that. Risks to privacy, yeah, so all the usual worries about retaining any information, what's collected, how long it's stored, who's allowed to access it, how they're allowed to use it. This is a problem for this idea and for any kind of thing, keeping a lot of data. Know your customer has the same problem too. And like I said, the biggest one to me feels like the unfairness accusation, that it's not fair if you don't know the rules ahead of time. And to the extreme, this could turn into retrospective legislation. And this example came to me from Wolfgang at breakfast when I mentioned this. He's like, what if they decided to ban caffeine? And they just tell you, and now they're like, oh, well, we have your urine from last year, and we've said caffeine is bad, and so your medal is getting stripped. Like it can definitely be abused, especially with certain politicians in power. And then the other one is other aspects of unfairness, I think, can be handled. They're a problem in any legislation, such as it's arbitrarily enforced. This is not just a problem, hindsight accountability, but the World Anti-Doping Agency has gotten criticism because there's some Chinese swimmers who tested positive. They were not punished. It's like, well, but they made an argument for accidental contamination. Do you believe their argument? This kind of stuff. And then the other problem this has come against the World Anti-Doping Agency is a lot of it is, in any of these systems, is a lot of it is in secret. It's kind of similar to the credit scoring thing too, where they feel like, and in the case of doping, they may be correct, unfortunately, people like Lance Armstrong running around, that they have to keep some of it secret. Because if they tell you when the test is coming, you'll game the system. And there's a story from Lance Armstrong that he got a text from a teammate saying they're doping at our hotel in Switzerland while he was still on the road. And he suddenly decided to drop out of the race and never took the urine test. So this is a problem. And now they need to change probably the rules about when you're allowed to drop out and things like that, or when you still have to take the test if you drop out. Like, there's just going to be a cat and mouse game with that. So the summary again, here's the big picture. Static rules are great for static domains. Dynamic domains need a whole bunch of tools. I've only started to outline them. Exogenous had the adaptive regulation, which just updates. That one, there wouldn't be unfairness because it's not retroactive. Regulatory sandboxes. And then for gaming regulations, hindsight accountability could be a start. I don't think it's a silver bullet, and there's probably more techniques too. And 3 things: evidence archiving, review, retroactive action. And if you game the system now, accountability will catch up later. And here's ChatGPT's illustration of that concept. If you want to read more, I put some of it on a blog. I have an SSRN paper too.